Johnson. Welcome to Live and Let Live, a program by and about libertarians of Austin and Central Texas. You can see Live and Let Live here on Austin Cablevision Channel 10 every Tuesday night at 10:30 and every Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I hope you will join us often. Today, our guest is Norm Berls, a local libertarian activist. Norm, welcome to the show.
Hi, Gary.
Norm is a member of the National Rifle Association, the Gun Owners of America, the Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, and Amnesty International. And today we're going to talk about the trends in government regulation of guns and gun control. Norm, the House of Representatives recently passed a bill to ban so-called assault weapons. What was this bill about, and just to start with, and what does it do?
Well, on the surface, this bill bans 19 different weapons. Some of these weapons are rifles, some of them are really pistols. They're all semi-automatic, and beyond that, what it does is it makes a list of attributes, and it gives the government the authority to, as a matter of just regulatory business, to add more weapons to this list.
So it's not just really 19.
No, it's really 184. If you look at the list of attributes and then look at the kinds of firearms that are available and say, okay, what's out there that matches this list of attributes, you really come up with 184 different guns. And that's for openers. There's also a provision in there which bans any magazine which holds more than 10 rounds of ammunition.
A magazine is?
It's basically a metal box with a spring on the inside, and it holds cartridges, and it forces the cartridges up to the top. And it's a feeding mechanism for semi-automatic guns.
Okay.
Any rate, what they're doing is they are grandfathering in all of these kinds of weapons and magazines which currently exist. And if you have, it's assuming this thing is worked out in a conference committee between the Senate and the House, it goes back and passes the Senate, passes the House, and is signed by the President, then it becomes law. It looks likely that this will happen. But assuming it does happen, people who have these things can grandfather them in. You'll have to go to a gun dealer if you have one of these kinds of firearms, and you'll have to fill out a form. I think it's a 4473. And you'll have to keep this form with that firearm from then on, forever.
You can still own it, but you have to do all this paperwork.
Right. And people who have these magazines, all of a sudden any magazine larger than 10 rounds is going to be illegal unless you owned it before the time this ban went into effect. And you will have to be able to prove this, which I don't know what that means, but I suspect it's going to mean something like taking any of these things that you might have, getting them photographed, taking them to, like, let's say, a notary public and making a statement, I have these things in my possession as of this date, and the notary public seeing them, counting them, and signing, oh yes, he's got them, and putting a stamp on it, and that way at a future date you'd be able to prove that you had these things before the ban.
And this form that you fill out, this goes on file somewhere?
Well, this form has actually been around since 1968, and any time since then that anybody has bought a firearm from a firearms dealer, they've had to fill out one of these forms. And these forms are required by law to stay with the gun dealer, and that's where they have stayed mostly. Now, when one of these dealers dies or goes out of business, then all these forms are forfeited. They go to the BATF and they shove them into a big warehouse where they more or less lose track of them.
Oh. Well, that's a relief, but they don't necessarily have to lose track of them. Potentially, they could not lose track of them.
They have been making some efforts. I know people who hold a federal firearms license and do business in this manner, and the BATF has been going around, going through their records, looking for people who have been buying certain kinds of firearms, mainly the kinds of things on this ban list, and building lists of these people. Now, this is illegal under the laws of this country right now. They're not allowed to look at these records unless they're investigating a crime or, well, unless they're investigating a crime trying to trace a weapon.
Maybe you explain, why is that illegal?
Well, it's a matter of law. I think it was built into the, well, I don't know whether it was the 1968 gun control law or whether it was another law. It may have been a law subsequent to that which forbade them to use these for any other purpose.
There has to be some kind of, let's say, probable cause
Right.
before they can start.
They have to be in the process of investigating a crime.
Okay. Now, this is at the federal level. This is what Congress has been doing. State legislatures have been passing gun control bills too, and they've been actually taking away people's right of self-defense. Where do you see this headed? What is this trend?
I guess the easiest answer to that is really not for me to say anything, but to let these people speak for themselves. On our local Libertarian Bulletin Board here in Austin, there is an internal memo which was spirited out of the Handgun Control Organization. And on this internal memo, they've made a list.
Sorry, is this a government agency or?
No, this is a private agency. Sarah Brady heads it up.
Handgun Control Incorporated.
Handgun Control Incorporated. They're promoting a lot of these anti-gun measures. At any rate, on their own memo and in their own words, they have listed down things that they think they can accomplish this year. They have listed things that are on their 5-year plan, and I can't read all of these, obviously, we don't have time, but I'd just like to read just the tops of the paragraphs on these. What are their general, what direction are they headed in? And there are things in the 5-year plan like the national licensing of all handgun purchases, state licenses for ownership of firearms, inspection licenses to let them come around and be paid for inspecting people's houses and the weapons they have. Other things like banning all military-style firearms, banning the carrying of a firearm anywhere but home or target range or in transit from one to the other, control of ammunition belonging to certain surplus firearms, eventual ban of handgun possession, banning of any ammo that fits military guns, banning of any quantity of smokeless powder or black powder which would constitute more than the equivalent of 100 rounds of ammunition, and on and on and on it goes. They have, after their 5-year list, they have a next 15 years list. And I'll read just one from that, and that is the total elimination of arms from society. Anybody who has paid attention to the firearms debate and has kept track of it for, let's say, the last 30 years is very much aware of the philosophy that these people are espousing. And looking at it, you can see where this philosophy leads. It leads to a total ban on firearms. It leads to a government monopoly on firearms. And now this is no more a reading of tea leaves, looking at their philosophy and trying to figure where is this leading. It's now down in black and white in explicit terms. They're after everything.
So I think one thing that's important to note here is they are leading toward a complete ban. That is their ultimate goal. But their interim steps that they list first are things like licensing and so forth, which a lot of people think are quite innocent and a lot of people who should know better actually support.
Exactly. What licensing would do, and they're pushing this is the next step, is to identify all those people who possess firearms to the government. It gives them a complete list. And once they know where the firearms are and who's got them, then it's a simple matter of passing a law. They know right where to go to get them. And okay, I know that some people are going to think that this sounds like paranoia, but in fact this has already happened. Back in 1968 in New York City, they required the registration of these so-called assault weapons, really semi-automatic rifles. And this was for the purpose of letting the police trace any of these weapons that might have been used in a crime. Well, that was 1968. Now, coming up, let's say 1992, I believe it was, they put in a law that made these things illegal. And they're using this registration list to go around and take possession of these things or force people to dispose of them, get them out of state, whatever. But yeah, the lists already have been used for that.
Now, there's been a lot of debate recently about what does the Second Amendment mean and all about the Second Amendment. The American Statesman published an editorial recently that said the Second Amendment does not guarantee the right to possess assault weapons. The so-called Center to Prevent Handgun Violence has been running newspaper ads in which 27 so-called constitutional scholars debunk the Second Amendment. What's going on here?
What's going on here is a major lie. Let me get out the editorial in question. there's a paragraph in here. The Second Amendment was framed by founding fathers who were suspicious of centralized power and standing armies, and they sought to guarantee to the states the right to maintain independent, quote-unquote, well-regulated militias. Okay, what these people are doing is taking the Second Amendment out of the context of the rest of the Constitution. And if you look at the Second Amendment in the context of the whole Constitution, you see that something is very strangely wrong with this viewpoint. Let me quote from the Constitution. This is Article 1, which gives powers to the Congress of the United States. Mm-hmm. In here it states, Section 8, Congress shall have power to provide for the common defense. It goes on. Congress is given the power to, quote, raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money shall be used for longer than 2 years. They're given the power to provide and maintain a navy. They're given the power to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. They're given power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And the Congress is given power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving for the states respectively two things: the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia, according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Finally, the last section under Article 1, 10, in the last paragraph says, quote, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace. Now, these are the same people who supposedly turned right around and said with the Second Amendment that they're giving states the power to maintain their own independent militia. Mm-hmm. Well, this is nonsense.
Right.
Very clearly, the federal government has been given the power to create, maintain, organize, and totally control the armed forces of this nation. What they did, what the Founding Fathers did, was to create a standing army. They knew they were doing this at the time they did it. They were afraid of it. They had seen standing armies abused in the past. And so, characteristically, they were looking to create a balance of power. And so, the thing that this editorial alludes to, that the Founding Fathers were suspicious of centralized power and standing armies, indeed they were. And so, that being the case, which makes more sense, to give a total, complete monopoly on firearms to this so-called militia which the government controls. I mean, all they're doing is giving, if you interpret it that way, all you've done is give all of the firearms to the government. Or if you take an alternative interpretation, that what they were really talking about is individual citizens. And in fact, at the time the Constitution was written, that's who made up these state militias. They were private individuals who owned their own weapons, and when they went to serve in the quote-unquote militia, they would bring their own weapons with them, and voila, there it was. And the logic that's being propagated here in this editorial and by these 27 so-called scholars is not worthy of a 10-year-old child. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is so totally in contradiction to what is written in this Constitution. I don't know, there are no words to describe it. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what are these people trying to do, putting this kind of a spin on this document? And I can come to only one conclusion, and that is they are attempting to deprive the citizens of this nation of firearms. They are trying to get a government monopoly on firearms. They are trying to build a totalitarian state.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things is the meaning of the word militia in the Second Amendment was referring to, as I understand it, the people, as opposed to what we now think of as a National Guard and so forth.
Yes, the National Guard is far removed from what the old militia was. I know, I mean, I was in the National Guard. Mm-hmm. And the label on our uniform said U.S. Army. We were trained at regular U.S. Army training bases right along with the regular troops. We were paid by the federal government. My paycheck came from the federal government. When I joined, I had to take an oath and promise to uphold the Constitution of the United States, not the Constitution of any state, but the Constitution of the United States. And all this is in line with the things I've just read you about what's in the Constitution. I mean, yeah, the Congress and the President were given these powers, and they're exercising them. And this is not the militia of old. You know, I did not own my own firearms and bring them with me and use those firearms in serving. I was provided with weapons by the government.
Now, one thing that is said is that, well, the Second Amendment was written when people had a different idea about militias and so forth, and it's not relevant anymore. What relevance is the Second Amendment to us today?
Well, human nature is constant. People today are basically the same as they were 200 years ago. They're the same as they were 1,000, 2,000 years ago. In this country, we are human beings, and we have no magical automatic immunity to the problems which have confronted the rest of the human race. In this whole debate about firearms, one of the key issues that's debated is murder. But always, 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 it is only the murders that are committed by private individuals. The murders that are committed by governments are never, ever discussed. No remedy is ever proposed for them. No consideration is ever given to the possibility that they might happen in the future. Now, what am I talking about here? I mean, is this a big problem or is it a little problem? Well, in the 20th century, the governments of this world have murdered more than 50 million human beings. Now, to bring that into perspective, if you take that and start dividing it out, that works out to about 57 human beings per hour, or almost one human being every minute, day in and day out for 100 years. That's what's been going on. And this is a big problem. And you have to ask yourself, and I think it's fair to ask ourselves and ask everyone, what do we do about this? How do we prevent this from happening in the future? And clearly, it seems to me that giving any government a monopoly on firearms is not moving in the direction of a solution to this problem.
Now, what you're really talking about, I take it, is genocide. In this whole act of the governments killing their own people. Is that right?
Yeah, mostly killing citizens of their own country, although there are examples on record of them using standing armies to kill citizens of other nations. And the logical question for people to ask is, well, why should we believe that it happens here?
Right. This, you know, I mean, that couldn't happen in the United States. Why should we worry about that? We're not like Germany or whatever. Why should we worry about that?
Well, I mean, again, human nature is constant, and we are human beings, and there's no reason to think that we have any kind of magical immunity to the problems that have confronted the rest of the human race. And it's really not appropriate to ask, can genocide happen in this country? The appropriate thing to ask is, can it happen again? Because it was the policy of the United States government from 1860 to about 1890 to commit genocide against the American Indian.
Right.
And if you move into the 20th century, there are hints, there are indications, there's very clear evidence that we have no magical immunity. You may recall that Japanese Americans were herded into concentration camps during World War II. And this is not the same thing as genocide, but it is an indication that concentration camps can be set up. There have been government murders. There was Kent State in 1970. 4 students were shot dead by the Ohio National Guard. You had the incident at My Lai with Lieutenant Calley, who, you know, was an American soldier. He wasn't that radically different from anybody else, but he was under extreme pressure. He was in very, very difficult circumstances, and he simply broke under the pressure. And I think almost any human being is capable of breaking under pressure.
You know, I think that a lot of people hearing this are going to think it's hard to believe that, you know, private citizens with small arms could stand any chance against the U.S. military with its tanks and its artillery. I mean, what would you say to these people?
Well, I would say they're right. We've seen the recent war in Iraq. where the U.S. military went up against what was basically a World War II type military and just wiped them out. And I think that if the citizens of this country with small arms were ever required to make a similar stand, they likewise would be wiped out. So what that says to me is the only thing that could reasonably be contemplated in this respect is the possibility of guerrilla war. To tell you the truth and to be completely honest, I don't think that's likely. And the reason I say that is this: if the government of this nation would go completely berserk, and this does happen from time to time, I mean, the maniacs do get control of these organizations. If it would go completely berserk and order the standing military to go out and commit genocide, what they would be doing is ordering the military to basically kill their own families, their own friends, and so on. And what the government would be asking for in that case would be a coup d'etat. Now, historically, standing armies have, in certain rare cases, been used to commit genocide, the Shanghai Massacre by the Japanese during World War II. But this is a case of an army going into a foreign country and killing the people of the foreign country, not killing their own people.
Right.
If you look at the way that genocide is usually conducted, Nazi Germany being one case, Soviet Russia under Stalin being another case, this is usually conducted by small groups of secret police who have been specially trained. They've been brainwashed into thinking that they are the saviors of civilization against this horrible menace, and if they don't do something, civilization is going to fall. This kind of brainwashing. And so what you're really, if you're talking about resisting genocide, what you're really talking about in the main is dealing with small groups of secret police organizations. They drive around in Black Mariahs at night. You know, there's maybe 6 or a dozen guys. They go out and arrest 2 people or 4 people or a small number like this. And these people could be resisted. And okay, this is me talking. These are my judgments at this point. Let me give you some judgments from somebody else. There is an organization in this country called JPFO, Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. What is that?
This is a group of people operating out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was founded by a fellow by the name of Aaron Zellman. And this is one fire-breathing civil rights organization. If you think the National Rifle Association is tough, you are very, very wrong. The National Rifle Association is a bunch of wimps compared to these guys. At any rate, Aaron Zellman founded this organization, and they have sundry publications. And at one point, Aaron Zellman interviewed a fellow by the name of Theodor Haas, who was an inmate of the Dachau prison camp in Nazi Germany. And he asks, it's a classical interview, he asks a series of questions, gets back a series of answers. And I'd like to read just a couple of these questions and a couple of the answers. Question by Aaron Zellman. Did the camp inmates ever bring up the topic, if only we were armed before, we would not be here now? And in response to this, Haas says, many, many times, before Adolf Hitler came to power, there was a black market in firearms, but the German people had been so conditioned to be law-abiding that they would never consider buying an unregistered gun. The German people really believed that only hoodlums owned such guns. What fools we were. It truly frightens me to see how the government, media, and some police groups in America are pushing for the same mindset. In my opinion, the people of America had better start asking and demanding answers to some hard questions about firearms ownership, especially if the government does not trust me to own firearms. Why or how can the people be expected to trust the government? There is no doubt in my mind that millions of lives could have been saved if the people had not been brainwashed about gun ownership and had been well armed. Hitler's thugs and goons were not very brave when confronted by a gun. Gun haters always want to forget the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is a perfect example of how a ragtag, half-starved group of Jews took up 10 handguns and made asses out of the Nazis. There's another question here. Again, this is Zellman. What words of warning would you like to give to young people who will soon be eligible to vote? And the answer from Haas, vote only for politicians who trust people to own all types of firearms and who would have a strong pro-Second Amendment voting record. Anti-gun ownership politicians are very dangerous to a free society. Liberty and freedom can only be preserved by an armed citizenry. I see creeping fascism in America just as in Germany, a drip at a time, a law here, a law there, all supposedly passed to protect the public. Soon you have total enslavement. Too many Americans have forgotten the tyranny that often masquerades as doing good. This fellow, Theodor Haas, was an inmate of Auschwitz. He survived, and how he survived is rather interesting. Right at the end of the war, the Germans were closing in, and the guards at the Dachau concentration camp felt that they were about to be overrun. But they had been given orders to just kill all the inmates. But because they were so afraid of being overrun and taken prisoner, they split. They left the scene. Well, a couple days went by, and nobody showed up. Meanwhile, Aaron Zellman in the camp was knowledgeable about firearms. He'd had them as a youth. He'd practiced with them. He knew how to assemble them. And there were miscellaneous parts laying around in this concentration camp. So he put them together and managed to assemble 3 working rifles. Well, once these concentration camp guards realized that they were not about to be immediately overrun, they went back to the camp with the intention of killing the inmates. Zellman and a couple of other guys opened fire on them as they came down the road. And the sound of these Italian rifles was different than what the Germans were used to hearing. And so they thought they were being fired on by an army, other than their own. And so they turned around and split. And so it was because this man armed himself and a few of his fellow inmates that he's alive today.
Well, I think that's a valuable lesson for all of us, and a valuable lesson for why we need to be armed, because it has happened elsewhere, and if we're not careful, it can happen here. We've been talking with Norm Berls, Libertarian Party activist, and we've been talking about the recent trends with gun control and the passage of the assault weapons ban bill. Norm, I want to thank you for being with us on Live
My
and Let
pleasure.
Live. And I want to thank you for joining us. You can see Live and Let Live here on Austin Cablevision Channel 10 every Tuesday night at 10:30, every Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. For Austin Libertarians, I'm Gary Johnson. Thank you for joining us.